Good afternoon, everybody. We're glad that you can join us today, and we're very excited that we have Kyle Clausen here with us as well. On behalf of the American College of Surgeons and the Young Fellows Association, the education group, we're really excited today about discussing with you salary negotiations and the use of Resolve. So I'm very excited to introduce Kyle Clausen, JD, who is the CEO of Resolve, who spent decades essentially helping physicians in their employment contracts and negotiating their employment contracts. Thousands of physicians each year use Resolve's tools, expertise, databases, and so forth that assist physicians and advocate for physicians in employment and negotiation contracting. Kyle is married to an ophthalmologist. He has 3 kids and a dog. And again, we're very excited to learn from him today. And thank you all for joining us.
I appreciate the introduction. It's good to be here with you guys too. I'm going to share screens here and hope that all this works. If there's any issues, please let me know. Wanted to give you just a quick overview. I always like to know what I'm going to get into when I am watching a webinar. We're going to do about a quick presentation here of about 20 minutes, and then I'd prefer to answer any and all questions that you guys have, because I think those are more important than just sitting here clicking through slides. So want to start out with just giving you my view of what the market looks like currently for physicians and for physician employment. These 3 bullets I think have been discussed, and I'm sure you're all aware of them, but we all know that there's a shortage of physicians right now, and that's likely to continue into the future. I think most studies, anticipate that that's going to only increase over the next 10 to 20 years. We also know that there's consolidation that's happened over the last decade. And what I mean by consolidation is when you're entering into the market and when you're looking at who can employ me and where can I go to work as a physician, and now the numbers are statistically, roughly 3/4 or 75% of all physicians are going to be employed, meaning they're not owning their own practice, they're not joining private groups, they're working for health systems, academic centers, things like that, some groups that are owned by private equity. And I'm not here to talk about whether those things are good or bad necessarily. I think that's a separate conversation, but it does change the dynamic of you looking at contracts, you looking at data, and you looking at how much leverage you have potentially in the market. And then also physicians in the last 5 years tend to have maybe a change and a shift in priorities as far as what they're after, what they're willing to accept from a work-life balance standpoint. Burnout's been well documented and discussed. And I think all of that comes into play when you're talking about your contracts. And so when we look at what your options are, out there, that employment mix and what type of practice you're going to join has a direct impact on what type of contract and what type of incentives you're going to see inside of those contracts. The more employed settings, right? The hospitals, the health systems tend to have higher guarantees. They tend to have larger signing bonuses, potential benefits like student loan repayment and things like that. And to go along with those things, you usually get less control, right? You're an employee, you have less upside, you don't get to participate in ancillaries, especially for surgeons, right? You're not going to be owning surgery centers, usually in those types of roles. And so you're losing out on that potential long-term upside and potential, as opposed to private practice where you're getting less guaranteed up front. There's partnership tracks, you may have to buy in to not only the practice, but surgery centers, but those come with the opposite, right? More autonomy, more control, more upside, for you long term. And so when you look at the market, obviously you don't want to go bottom right quadrant. You don't want to go with a low guarantee and no control. And if you can find contracts that are structured to give you more guarantees with that upside, obviously that's the best case scenario for you. And so my goal is to today hopefully help educate you on how to shift where you end up, regardless of practice type that you want to be in, to something that has as much guarantee, as much benefit for you, with also as much control as possible in that setting. So my suggestion for you as you're looking at contracts, as you're identifying, what's important to you in your situation, what we see from clients is that usually the contract discussion starts well before, right, they receive a piece of paper. They've had to decide on where they want to work, what they're going to prioritize, whether that's time, scope of practice, or compensation, right? All those things are going to factor into where you should be looking in the market. And I'm not, again, going to discuss that in detail today, but it is an important factor, as you take a look at contract terms. What I want to hit on is the next three. I want to make sure you guys understand contract risk and items that you should be spotting in every single contract and paying attention to those. I want you to make sure you're going to review market data and understand what market data is out there for you. And I want to make sure that you understand how to negotiate in good faith and just some things that you may run into through the negotiation process. So the first thing that we're going to talk on is contract risk. And what I mean by contract risk is every contract is going to have varying levels of detail as far as what's included. You might see some contracts that are 5 pages long, and you're going to have some that are 100 pages long. It doesn't mean that some are better or worse. It means that, you know, the 100-page one has probably a more expensive legal team to some extent that's drafting in every potential contingency. What I want you to pay attention to, if you pay attention to nothing else, are the things on this slide. Okay, and I've got them categorized into 3 columns here. And the first one we're going to talk on is scheduling and duties and just your responsibilities. Okay. Most contracts are going to start out with very little detail on this and or language that's structured broadly enough to give the employer complete control over these items. So if where you practice is important to you, meaning you're supposed to be in one location, but maybe there's satellite locations, or maybe there's, you know, within the health system, multiple spots that you could potentially work at. If that's not defined in the contract, it should be if that's important to you. Okay. Days of the week, call schedule, right? All that ties into what you're going to be doing day in and day out. And this is usually the area where physicians burn out or where they get frustrated first, is because they were told something in an interview process that turns out to be not true, right? Call was supposed to be 1 and 4, and now I'm on 1 and 3 because somebody left or retired. Or I was only supposed to satellite 1 day a month, and now I'm satelliting, right, every week. Those are the things that contractually it's important to get clarified, because especially in the new market that we're in, with more and more physicians being employed, I don't want to take the position that you shouldn't trust administrators or you shouldn't trust the people drafting the contracts, but they move around too, right? So the person that you're negotiating with today may not be there in 2 years. And so if they weren't privy to the conversation, if they don't know what you were told in the interview process, the only thing they're going to have to look back on is the document. And so scheduling and duty is really important. Make sure your call is defined as best as it can be. Make sure if you have interest in outside activities, side gigs, things like that, that you're getting that clarified. And certainly if you have intellectual property, either prior to joining the group or something that you plan on working on after the fact, that you would get that clarified. Okay. The next bucket I want to touch on is compensation. And this one is obviously going to be a main part of our discussion today. We're going to talk about data sources on this, but the things that you should look for in your compensation and benefits are going to hit these following categories. Okay. Almost every contract is going to have a base or a guarantee. It's really, really rare that you're going to be on production only, at least in the initial first 2 or 3 years. Okay. If you do move to production, or if there is a production bonus in place, it's likely going to be based on total collections for your professional services or work RVUs. And if you're not familiar with work RVUs, every time you enter in a CPT code, there's a correlating work RVU value on that. And there's going to be a certain threshold in your contract that if you cross 5,000 work RVUs, for example, you're going to get paid a bonus with a conversion factor that multiplies against those work RVUs. And so we'll walk through an example on that here shortly. But it's most common to have a base plus production. Some of you may see quality bonuses. Those have been, I think, emphasized a little bit more in the last 5 years, and I think will be, continue to be emphasized. That being said, it should make up a fairly small component of your total comp. So if your quality bonus is, above 10% of your total compensation, I would have questions on that, and I'd really want to make sure you understand what metrics you have to hit and if those metrics are within your control or not on whether that component will be paid. Okay. Depending on setting, you may see things like student loan forgiveness, retention bonuses, stipends that'll be paid to you while you're in training, residency and fellowship. And then every contract should have CME, allowances and reimbursements, vacation time, and other benefits. The one negotiation tip I'll give for you on benefits is that group benefits are things that can't be changed. So when we talk about group benefits, it's things like health insurance, retirement plans. Those are items that they have to apply equally to everyone. They sign third-party contracts with their retirement carrier, with the health insurance company. And so you should evaluate those, and you should understand what the value is. And if it's, good, bad, or ugly as far as what benefit they're providing. But I don't want you to spend a lot of time trying to push or negotiate or change those items, because your time will be better served on some of these other areas. Okay. And then the third bucket we're going to talk about is termination issues. We always want to plan, the exit when you're signing the contract, which is sometimes uncomfortable, but most physicians are going to have more than one employer throughout their career. And so you need to know up front before you even get into the setting what that looks like. There should be notice provisions about how much notice you have to give the employer, and vice versa, how much notice they have to give you before you can walk away. There's going to be without cause termination in the contract along with for cause termination. And this distinction between those two is that a for cause termination means you did something wrong, which also means there's very little notice that's required to give to you before you have to leave. And so if there's anything in those sections that are for cause that are too broad or that aren't defined well, like you just violate a policy or procedure, right, of the employer, if that can result in immediate termination, that's a term that you probably want to get some notice on, right? You want to have at least 30 days maybe to correct or to cure a deficiency rather than being walked out the door immediately. Okay, so once we know how the contract can terminate and what notice periods are there, the two biggest things that are going to impact you, one is tail coverage on your malpractice insurance and whether or not you have that, because if you don't have that, it's going to be something that's an expense to you, right? And the tail coverage varies by specialty, and it's generally 1.5 to 2 times your annual premium. And so it can be a fairly expensive amount that you have to pay. Sometimes your next employer may pick that up, but oftentimes they won't. And so if you're negotiating a contract and you're looking at value of the contract, we always think that those are roughly equivalent to the signing bonus. So whatever your signing bonus is probably a pretty good indicator of what tail might look like on the back end. And so if you don't have either of those, obviously that's something you're going to want to advocate and ask for. Okay. The last one in the termination section that I wanted you to be careful on is non-competes. We've got an entire separate slide on this, but non-competes really reduce your leverage later on. So if you're in a renegotiation situation, or if you just want to move to a different job in the future, if you didn't understand your non-compete up front, or you signed one that was too broad and it's limiting you, it's really going to put a difficult time on where you can go to work, but also if you want to renegotiate what type of leverage you have on that. Okay. So we're going to talk about those things in more depth here in a second. But the first thing I want to do is walk you through an example of what fairness can look like in a compensation plan and a compensation structure, and some of the deficiencies that we see throughout different contracts. And so I want to walk you through a work RVU model first. The analysis is going to be the same for a collection model. But if you're taking a look at your contract and your base salary is $200,000 and you look at fair market value data, right? And it says that the median for your specialty for that location is also $200,000. Please don't stop your analysis at that step, which is what a lot of our clients do, and what I think a lot of physicians do. You need to look at what you're producing to get to those numbers, because most of you are still on a production model. And so if your contract requires 3,000 work RVUs, right? So in that first column, the production threshold is 3,000 before you bonus. And you look at the data, and the data says the median is 2,500. When I look at that analysis, I say you're short 500 work RVUs, right? They're asking you to produce 3,000 when everybody else, right, in the area produces 2,500 to get to the same level. Okay. And so then the only question is what are those 500 work RVUs worth? And if the median number is 40, for your specialty, that's a $20,000 deficiency in your compensation. Okay. And so that example, right, of analyzing your base against the threshold with a multiplier can apply to any of these models, right? Some of you may be on a billings model, but that's getting less and less common. Most of you are probably on a work RVU or a collection model. And so in the collection column, it's the same analysis. If you have a base of 200, the median's 190, you're actually up 10, right? You're up 10,000 in that situation. But when you look at the production threshold at 600 and the median's 500 and the multiplier is 30, it means you're short $30,000 on your production, even though you're positive 10 on your base. And so overall, right, you combine those, you're short 20,000, assuming you can produce the median. So that's kind of step one, is understanding how the games can be played, right? And what levers might be being pushed by the employer to pay you at a rate that may not be commensurate for the work that you're doing. All right. And we're going to talk about in a second how to find data and what to look like and how to analyze that. But that's the concept that I want you to take from this. Okay. So what do we see from movement, right, on those buckets, and how much, does $20,000 or $30,000 a year mean to you? I think it's good to understand that if there's usually about 10%, right, for negotiation in most of the examples that we see, what that means over a 30-year career is about $2.5 million worth of earnings, of career earnings. Okay. So small amounts or relative small amounts per year, percentage wise, can really extrapolate themselves over a 30-year career. And so anytime that you're renegotiating comp, if you're not at fair market value, you're really doing yourself, I think a disservice on what that means for your total earnings. Okay. All right. Next thing I want to talk about, example quickly, is non-competes and what these look like. There's a lot of discussion about non-competes right now nationally with the FTC, right, issuing potentially a rule that's going to ban them, and we hope that they do. But for now, they're still in place, and they probably will be at least for the next year to year and a half until that works its way through. And so what non-competes are, if you're not familiar with them, is a contract clause that says post-termination, if you're no longer employed, with this organization, you're not allowed to work in a certain area for a certain amount of time. Okay. And there are historically valid reasons to have non-competes. It's why we allow them generally. In healthcare, it's a little bit difficult, and it's becoming more difficult with the expansion into these health systems and employed settings, because there's no longer just one circle on the map, right, that we're drawing a 5-mile circle from, for example. If they're drawing a 5-mile circle from every single location that they have, it's essentially going to wipe you out of the area, right? And the larger the circle, right, obviously the worse it is for you. We would tend to take a look at what your options are, right, outside of those circles, and if that's an issue for you individually or not. You definitely want to think about exclusions to these rules. So if it's a 2-year and 5-mile non-compete, what happens if they're in breach of contract? Or what happens if they terminate you for no reason? Or what happens, if you're in private practice, what happens if the practice gets bought out by private equity before you become a partner, right? Are the non-competes still intended to be in place in those situations? I think the answer to that should be no, right? I mean, I think you should be asking for exclusions to these things. But as of today, it's in most states still a question of whether or not they can be enforced and whether they're reasonable or not. And it's going to be a case-by-case analysis. And so my advice to you is, rather than let a judge decide, post-termination of a contract if it's reasonable or not, I would do your best to try to get them out of the contract before you sign it. Okay. Non-competes are probably, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, probably one of the worst things for you on a leverage standpoint if you're going to renegotiate in the future. The FTC in their proposed rule discusses physicians specifically, and in that there's a study that says roughly they believe that the market would see a 37% increase in physician compensation if non-competes were done away with. And so that's a surprising number, I think, for most. That means that in theory, right now, that there's a 37% underpayment. And if we want to use that same example from before, that's about 9.3 million in earnings. If it's, 10% equals $111,000 each year. So these are extremely important. They're extremely detrimental to giving you flexibility in your career, to giving you leverage to negotiate. And so do your best to try to eliminate those up front if you can. Okay. All right, we're going to talk about market data now. So let's assume you can spot all of those issues, right? And that you get those flagged and that you understand what you're looking at. You still need to know what's fair for the area, okay? And so there's different categories of market data. There's going to be survey data that's out there. And so these are the first list here is acronyms of some of the biggest surveys that you're likely to see. MGMA, AMGA, AAMC, Sullivan and Cotter, Pinnacle, Doximity has stuff out there. Some of the other recruiting firms post salary information. Some of the job boards like, ZipRecruiter and others post surveys. The reason that these are important, and the reason that the ones in the top 4 here are probably most important, is that your contract likely references one of them as a data point for a comp cap. And so if it does, if you have language like this that says, notwithstanding anything else, we can't pay you above the 90th percentile of MGMA or Sullivan and Cotter or whatever it is, that's in my mind a validation of that data source for purposes of fair market value. Okay. And so if your employer is going to lean on that for compliance, you should also be able to lean on that for your negotiation and being paid fairly. So if your contract's referencing a survey, and it's likely MGMA, make sure that you are taking a look at that data and getting access to that to know what medians are, to know what conversion factors should look like, to know what thresholds should look like, to know what the average signing bonuses are. Okay, all of that's really important. The second category that you can look at is data like what we have on our site from other verified contracts of your colleagues. This information is all de-identified, so you're not going to know who it is, but you can go through and sort and say, okay, tell me, for my specialty in this state, what's a contract that's come out recently, right? What does that look like? Okay, and I'm going to walk you through how that looks on our site here in a second. And then the last one is other offers that you would have in hand. And this is going to be your best point of data and your best leverage point. If you have an offer sitting side by side, roughly in the same geography, you're going to know at that moment in time what your fair market value is and what you're worth. Okay. And so like any data set, there's nothing that's perfect, right? And so I think it's good to know that going in, but the more data that you have, the better off you're going to be. Okay. And so what I want to do now is, I hope you guys can see this on the screen. I want to walk you through what these tools can look like for you on our platform. If you need to get access to survey data, once you're logged in, you can go ahead and pick your specialty. It'll show you snapshot data. It's not going to show you the entire survey, but it'll show you a snapshot of at least what median comp looks like, right? For my specialty, what median work RVU thresholds look like, what conversion factors look like, okay? If I'm on a collection basis, I can toggle between that. If I'm in an academic setting, I can toggle between those items. And these are things that you should be paying attention to and you should be taking a look at as part of your review, okay? The second thing that we talked about is access to verified contracts and looking at what your peers have received in the past. Okay, so unlike MGMA data or other data that's out there, if you go through and sort and you say, I am a general surgeon and I want to see other verified contracts in a certain state like California, you can scroll through here and see previous contracts and the ranges and signing bonuses and relocation allowances. And if you drill into those, there's other details like work RVUs, conversion factors, what the non-competes look like, what the tail coverage was, right? So it's beyond just compensation. There's details here that are really important for you guys to pay attention and see, okay? And the third tool that I want to tell you about on the site, and this is, some of these are free tools that you can go look at, is this rating and contract scorecard. So if you don't have any idea, right, of what you should be earning or what a normal non-compete looks like, and you just want a general reference, you can go through here, select your specialty, you can hop down and say, I've got a non-compete of 24 months. How does that look? Well, that's about average. I'm in a medium-sized city and it's a 1 mile non-compete. Well, we would say that that's better than most, right? It's a 15-mile non-compete. And it's a little bit worse than what we see in a lot of the contracts that come through, okay? And so I would encourage you to take a look at these tools, these items that are out there for you when you're negotiating, because if you don't have a starting point, you don't have a reference for what's fair, it's really hard to go into a negotiation in good faith and ask for certain items to be, adjusted, okay? All right, so back to the last point, and then we'll get to questions. How you negotiate is important. So once you've gone through, you've identified issues, you know what fair market value is, you know what the normal terms are, you need to negotiate in good faith, okay? And so what that looks like is understanding upfront what your best alternative is and knowing what your kind of end game is for the negotiation. Understanding that most contracts that we see are changed in some form or fashion, even though everybody's going to tell you that this is a standard contract that never gets changed. That's rarely true from where we sit, okay? And so I think you've got to understand that asking for the things that are important to you has to happen. Understanding what your deal breakers are has to happen. And also the way that you communicate is important, okay? And so quick example here of just language from an email from an interaction that we had with an employer. You can see that they start out saying that this contract is standard, right? It's been vetted by everyone over 15 years. We never make changes. And then halfway through, it's that being said, we did make an adjustment to the non-compete because we knew that it was important for this position. And, they're having a hard time recruiting. So I think you've got to just, unfortunately, play the game. You need to know what's important to you. You need to make sure you're asking for those things. And if you do that the right way, and if you come into it with data to help support you on that, I think you're going to be in a much better position. So that was 25 minutes, but I'm going to stop. I'm going to take questions. And I'm happy to jump back to any slide that you guys want, or just answer those things via chat and QA.
Thanks so much, Kyle. Appreciate it. Thanks so much for the knowledge. I'm sure a lot of us spend a lot of time with clinical work and treatment algorithms, but of course, a lot of us tend to be relatively nervous when it comes to negotiations and salaries and contracting. So always learning from your expertise is super helpful. So we have a question out there from a Dr. Harris. I'll say, how do you negotiate for a surgical specialty? For example, breast surgery, if they're using general surgery MGMA data.
Yeah, I that doesn't make sense to me. I guess. I mean, when you're negotiating anything and when they're getting a fair market value evaluation on anything, it should be as close to your specialty and as close to your geography as possible. So if we go back to the MGMA data on this, if you're looking at any specialty, and this is just for an example purpose, the national numbers are going to vary dramatically versus the eastern region versus the southern region. And obviously different specialties have different factors all over the place. So if they're not utilizing the right data set, I mean, that's kind of a non-starter for me. I mean, if you're, in a specialty that has data to support it, and some don't. I mean, there are some very small subspecialties sometimes where there's not enough data there, but assuming that there is data behind this, I would be presenting them with as much information as you can and justifying why that's the right thing to do. I mean, it's like getting an appraisal on a house, right? But not using the same neighborhood. It just doesn't make sense.
And for follow-up for that, Kyle, if you don't mind, do you think that shows poor faith on behalf of the possible employer, that they're trying to, trick a potential, employee, if you will? Or do you think that just a lot of them are not necessarily well-versed enough to understand that there are some nuances when it comes to specialties?
I think most employers are quite well versed on the data. And I think they understand the distinction. If they're using MGMA for general surgery, I think they are well aware that there's, breast surgery as well, data out there. So I don't want to say it's in bad faith, but I think they're aware of the data. I'll just put it that way.
Okay. Coming to non-competes. If non-competes we have another question from, I'm going to call Dr. Jensen here, but if non-competes are banned, will that null the current clauses in established contracts that are already present?
Yeah. The answer is I don't know for sure, but I would doubt it. So, I mean, most laws when they're enacted don't go retroactive, right? I mean, we let people have the bargain that they created right initially, but I also think it's going to be extremely difficult for anybody to enforce them. So if they're not already banned in your state, and very few states have them banned currently, to go in front of a judge and say that this is reasonable and we think it should be in place when the FTC nationally has banned them, that's a pretty tough argument to make. But I don't think automatically they'll be void, no.
Here, we got lots of questions coming up here, so get ready there, Kyle.
Yeah.
What is the best resource for obtaining MGMA numbers or path track if you're looking at a particular specialty? Is there a resource, or is Resolve supply all?
That feels like a softball. Yeah, right here on the Resolve dashboard, you can get that. So to purchase MGMA's data individually is too expensive, right, for any one person. We have heard clients talk about, getting on, Reddit and other places. That data is going to be, one, it's going to be old. Two, it's a copyright violation. They're not supposed to do it. But three, there's about 1,000 ways you can sort MGMA, right? You can base it on demographics. You can base it on years of experience. And so anything that you see, and even the snapshot that you see initially on our site here, is not going to have full access to that. And so you're going to have to, engage with someone to find out, exactly for your situation what that looks like. Contracts in your specialty, The one nice thing that I think about our site is when you can hop in here and check that, but we also send you a notification every time a new one comes on. And so if you're just wanting to be updated on the market, I think that's a quick and easy way to do it.
Cool. Again, a couple of more, but in your experience, do new surgeons who are willing to work in very rural areas have more negotiating power or leverage than in the urban job market? That's what we seem to hear, and that's one of the people asking a question here.
Yeah, I think that's just a supply and demand question, right? And so rural health has a much harder time recruiting, just in general, than San Diego or Denver or some of these other metros where people tend to want to live a little more frequently. And so I think the answer is yes. You can certainly have more leverage there. We certainly see recruitment incentives that are better in rural settings than we do elsewhere. But that being said, long term, most, as long as there's volume there for you, if your conversion factor, your percentage is right, after maybe that first 5-year period, when those incentives wear off, I think the gap is smaller, right, at that point in time. But some of it just has to do with monopolies, whether you're going to be the only provider right in that area, so your volumes can be as heavy as you want them to be, along with those initial recruitment incentives. I think that's where the biggest gaps come in.
Okay. One of our attendees asked, should maternity leave be outlined specifically in the contract?
Yeah, we would like to see it outlined specifically. I mean, the good and bad news on maternity leave is that there are some, obviously, federal and state laws that protect the time off on that, but that's unpaid time, and it's usually only after you've been there for a year. And the employer size has to be right too. And so if you're looking for paid maternity time off, you should be asking for that in the contract. It's also a benefit that we don't see being provided very frequently yet. And so if that's important to you, you should definitely be asking that to be included.
From Dr. Bardiner, any advice for those of us who are already employed and how to renegotiate without threatening to leave or go elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that's part of a good faith negotiation, right? Is that, when COVID happened and reimbursements, changed a little bit this last year with the fee schedule, the employers are very quick to turn around and hand you an amendment that says compensation rates are changing, right? Whether you're in a contract, that's locked into a term, or whether it's one that's just auto renewing, they're going to come to you if fair market value changes. And so I think it's always fair for you to go to them if you know that you're being underpaid, right? It's not negotiate just to negotiate, but if you're at the 25th percentile, right, and you're producing at the 50th percentile, that's a fair question to ask. I don't think you need to threaten to leave, but I think it's almost implied, right, at some level. If you know you're being underpaid, you're not going to be underpaid forever, or most people won't. And so I don't think you need to threaten it. I think it's just an implied condition of any negotiation that if they're unwilling to move, you're probably going to start to look elsewhere.
Speaking about renegotiation, when's the right time for negotiation? When they offer you the offer letter, or after the contract is sent? When do you start considering that?
Yeah, definitely before you sign anything. So negotiations are probably going to start, maybe even in your interview. I mean, they may disclose some numbers at that point and try to get your feel for how, acceptable those are to you. But certainly don't sign off on a offer letter or memorandum of understanding or term sheet, whatever they call it, before you're happy with those numbers. Because even if those things are legally not binding on you, sometimes they are, but a lot of times they're not. It's just really hard to get them changed. If you've signed a document that says I'm willing to be paid $250, for you to come back later, 3 or 4 days later with a contract and you say you want $300, it's just not something that's going to go over very well. So if you're going to negotiate in good faith, do it early.
From one of the other attendees, can we look at the verified contract median data from Resolve? Or do we need to be members for that? And if yes, what does that entail?
You can look at some of the contracts for free, and the contract scorecard for free. If you want the full details and MGMA data, that's what is included under our data subscription. And so you'd have to go on and pay for that. All the pricing is flat feed. It's on the site. You can go take a look at it anytime you'd like to. And also members of ACS on that topic do get a discount. I think that's going to be emailed out after this. And so if you're interested in that, I would wait maybe 30 minutes until that email comes out.
Okay. Lots and lots more questions here, Kyle. Do you approach negotiating for an academic position differently than a private group? for someone just out of training? And what do you find motivates most academic institutions for is negotiate if what you might be proposing is not of interest to the other party?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can negotiate with any type of organization. So as a starting point, there's nobody that I've run into that is unwilling to have a conversation on that by employer type. I do think if you're, coming to a position new, whether it's out of training or you're just moving to town, that's different than if you're renegotiating, because if you're renegotiating, you've got some of your own data, right? You've got your own production numbers, you've got things to look at and almost audit, right, on an annual basis to take a look at. But if they're not interested in negotiating a term, I think that's why, a few slides back, we talked about, having multiple offers and knowing what the market looks like. I think that's why it's important to have those things, because you need to find an employer that fits the values and the things that are most important to you. Compensation is not the most important thing for everyone. And I'm not here to say that it should be. I just think that, if call or if 4 days a week or, whatever it is that you want is important and they're not willing to budge on it, I think you'll find somebody that will do that.
Yeah, makes perfect sense, actually. Here's another question. With employers like large hospital systems, what things are the most likely to be negotiable? Because a lot of times we've been told that the contract itself isn't really negotiable. Things like non-compete, tail, signing bonus, salary, RVU bonuses, what's really negotiable? Because most of the times we've been told that the contract itself is not really negotiable.
Yeah, there are some organizations that want to keep what I'll call the main body of their contract consistent, and they'll make any type of edits or modifications or carve outs and exhibits. That's more of a procedural, how we're gonna, make these adjustments rather than it is what we're gonna negotiate and what we're not. And so if it's language that they're wanting to keep the same, like outside activities, for example, right? They want to have the same outside activity or conflict of interest policy for everyone. It doesn't mean that you can't negotiate the non-compete, or it doesn't mean that you can't negotiate a signing bonus or something else that might be unique to your specialty and your situation down in the exhibits. So my experience also with health systems is that they're not consistent from what we see. And sometimes they will, hold the line and not make any adjustments because maybe they have 4 or 5 candidates at that point in time. But oftentimes, if you tell them you're walking away, it's all of a sudden, well, what change do you need, to make sure you sign the contract? And so that's unfortunate, right? That it might take that at some point, but I think you need to ask for everything that's important to you.
Any advice on considerations for setting a salary when partnership in the group depends on making 125 to 150% of my salary? Or does this just depend on how bullish I feel about my own productivity? It's from one of the attendees.
Yeah, I mean, can you read that one more time? I'm not sure I followed the 150% part.
I just lost.
Okay. I mean, I think, yeah, if you're in any type of group setting, right? If there's any type of group production that's going on, I think that's the question. I mean, I think you've got to decide on your end, how busy you're going to be, I think is important, right? How hard you want to work, or how hard is probably the wrong word, but how much you want to work is important. And just understanding too, what systems are set up around you for efficiency, right? Do you have a scribe? Do you not? Are you supported in the right way with MAs or other things? I mean, I think all those things factor into the setting and deciding how aggressive you want to be with it. Most places are willing to have a conversation on any item, whether it's compensation or other. And so I think that, again, going back to you always have to ask. That's my most important takeaway for you, is if you don't ask, you're never going
to know. From Dr. Rodriguez, do you have any advice on pre-employment contracts that offer a stipend while the resident or fellow is in training to go and work with that institution when the training's finally completed?
Yeah, I think those are great, as long as you're sure that's where you want to be. So most of those stipends and signing bonus as well, they're going to come with clawback kind of provisions to them, or repayment obligations if it doesn't work out. And so, we have had clients that have come into situations where they've signed maybe too early, or they've changed specialties or subspecialties. And so I think, understanding what your repayment obligations are on those, understanding how they're taxed, because they're usually not taxed until they're forgiven. But sometimes employers treat those the wrong way. And so as long as you're well versed in them, I think they can be very beneficial. There's no reason not to take additional, compensation or additional resources if it's available to you.
And Kyle, in terms of compliance, is it standard to go by 90% cap as you discussed, or does a fair evaluation demand a look at the cost of the next best alternative solution?
Yeah.
One of the attendees says they asked us because they've been faced with a compliance argument due to excessive call pay, and they charge 1/5 of the alternative. So is this a true compliance issue?
Yeah, well, the compliance issue is that they're not supposed to pay more than fair market value for the services being provided. So the cap there is purely for what I would say is audit purposes, right? To say, hey, we never pay more than the 90th percentile. Sometimes it's 75th percentile, right? It's not a standard that they have to follow. It's just whatever their legal team thinks is appropriate. That being said, if you're producing, I mean, somebody produces at the 100th percentile, right? That's why it's in the data. And so if you're that person, if you're producing at the 95th or the 99th percentile, or you're taking a lot of call, that still can be a fair market value number for you, right? It's not that the total number is wrong. It just has to be tied to what you're doing. And so some contracts will even say, and they'll have carve outs for that. It's 90th percentile or, right, 125% of what you did the year before, or 90th percentile, or, based on an audit, what what MGMA says or whatever the survey they're citing says is fair market value for that. So certainly be careful on that information, because if you do just sign a hard cap, that's what it is. It doesn't matter what you produce. If you go past it, they're going to limit your comp.
That doesn't sound too good. Well, I guess what's the best way to know if you're being offered a fair RVU threshold and conversion factor for a given market? From your experience, are these numbers uniform statewide or per locality?
Okay, so they're definitely different by region, right? And so the best way that I would tell you to take a look at that is if you go into this MGMA component, you select your specialty, you're going to get a table down here that's going to show you total comp with a threshold, with a work RVU value tied to it. And if you have differences, right, on, well, show me if I'm in the Midwest, show me what it looks like. You can do that. MGMA will let you sort by state to some extent if they have enough data in that pool. And so you can drill down and do a little bit further analysis on this. But as a starting point, they don't fluctuate a lot, right? By region. I mean, they're going to be within a certain delta of each other. And so I would recommend that you come and hit this site and hit this page, get a snapshot of where you should be at. And then from there, take a look at your individual characteristics and if those are helpful or hurtful for you based on the kind of the national and regional numbers.
A couple more here before we got to wrap up, but can employers limit the practice of medicine outside the confines of the institution? Is that a violation of the, I guess, the physician's property?
That I think is the outside activity prohibition, right? And so most contracts are going to start out saying that you're not allowed to do any type of outside activity, including practicing medicine, right? You're not allowed to moonlight or do locum work unless they say it's okay. And we don't like that language. You guys shouldn't like that language either. Generally, you should have authority to do that unless it starts to be competitive with them or conflicts with them, right? Obviously, they're employing you. They have some interest that they need to protect. You need to be able to show up for work, right, et cetera. But if it's on the weekends or if it's on your time off, in my mind, there's no reason to have that prohibition, as long as you have malpractice insurance and kind of all the other boxes are checked.
And then what do you think the average time is from, starting a contract negotiation to getting to a contract, a resolution? And I can speak to that. I've had several people apply and it was taking so long, they got cold feet and they actually decided to go elsewhere, even though of process. So what's an appropriate amount of time, particularly if you're a new grad? Let's just say, when should you start looking and when should you start having cold feet and thinking, oh, this is not going anywhere?
Yeah. Well, employers can be notoriously slow, right? And legal teams and comp committees and things like that can take time to approve those. We usually see most decisions, though, being made within 3 to 5 weeks, right, is a fairly normal timeline from start to finish. It can be quicker than that. I mean, it can be, right, a 1 week turnaround if everybody's motivated to get it done. If you're coming out of training or even if you're in a current job, I mean, you need to look at what your notice period is. If you have to give 120 days, for example, notice, well, that means you need to be looking, 5, 6, 7 months prior to when you want to leave, so you can give that proper notice on the way out. If you're going to graduate in July, like most do and leave training, a lot of final year residents are going to sign contracts from September through, March or April. And so, most people want to have time to get licensed, to get credentialed, to do all those things if you're going to be moving. And so don't box yourself in and don't limit your negotiation leverage with time. That's the one thing that you can control as long as you apply early and apply, to every spot that you want to be at the same time, because otherwise you're going to have, some conflicting, interest there too. If somebody wants you to sign and somebody, you're still waiting on an interview elsewhere, that can be problematic.
All right, I'm going to give you two more here, Kyle, real quick,
Okay.
even
Sure.
though we have tons. But with the recent 2023 CMS payment reductions, is it legal for health organizations to pass those reductions to surgeons most impacted by these procedural rate reductions if employed? Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, I think your contract is going to dictate if they're allowed to do that legally or not. We certainly see them wanting to, pick and choose what's best for them, right? And if it's better for them to use 2020 rates, they may want to implement that. Some specialties saw work RVU numbers increase fairly dramatically. Well, they wanted to then say, we can't pay you that, right? Because you're going to bonus too high. So the answer is you need to check your contract if they're legally allowed to do it or not. They may not be, and if they're not, I would, certainly, force them to renegotiate if it's something that they have to do.
All right, I'm going to give you one more question. Before I say, Brad and the ACS team, can you please make sure we have all the links to Resolve for any of the attendees if they want to click on that or reach that, find a way to get more information or get in touch with Kyle and his team. So please make sure you put that in the chat so they can reach that or get the link, please. One more question for you, Kyle. Do health system employers frown on a third party negotiating your contract like Resolve, negotiating your contract for you?
Sure.
It seems somewhat less personal. That's something we have.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly common question. I mean, they prefer to talk to you, right? Always. And I think there's some benefit for you to talk to them as well, because you're going to go to work there, right? You're going to want to have relationships. You need to know how they're going to treat you from a business standpoint. But that being said, if you're uncomfortable with that, and or if there's things that are just wrong, right, or legal's telling you something that can't happen, we're happy to help with that. We're happy to help negotiate. We do that for a lot of our clients. And so I think there are certain settings where it's maybe better for one or the other to have that happen. If they think it's a red flag, I would think that that's a red flag back, right? I mean, they have a legal team. They wrote the contract with a handful of lawyers. If they're upset or concerned about you having counsel, you may want to look somewhere else.
Agreed. Well, I'm going to wrap it up for us, Kyle. I just want to say thank you very much. Thank you so much for taking the time and for your expertise. On behalf of the ACS and the Young Fellows Association Education Work Group, this has been really, really helpful. The recording of this will be available. And again, all the ways to contact Kyle and his team and Resolve. It's an opportunity with the ACS. It's on the ACS website as well to be able to involve them and actually join them as a member or get a membership. So, Kyle, with that, thank you very much for your time and your expertise and for answering all these questions. And I know it's going to generate a lot more discussion, a lot more questions for a lot of physicians nowadays, for those that are looking for a job and for those looking to renegotiate their current employment.
Sounds great. Appreciate you guys having me on.
All right. Thanks so much. All right, everybody. Have a great afternoon and have a great day.